story is true. The names have been changed, except my own. When I was 30 years old, I found myself working for the Veterans Administration, New York Regional Office. And in that old building on 7th Avenue and 24th Street, there were a lot of stories. Most of them sad, because nobody comes to the government to tell you how happy they were. I was working in the loan guarantee section, and what that meant was that I reviewed mortgage applications to make sure the veterans could afford the houses they wanted to buy. And I answered the phone, and I could tell right away from that the voice on the other end belonged to an elderly African-American woman from the Deep South. Now, as a transplanted Southerner myself, I felt an instant kinship and wanted to help her. And she said, "Can you help me get my deeds?" And I had never heard that question before, so I asked for more information. It turns out she was receiving a pension as a dependent parent of a deceased veteran, and when her son was alive, he had purchased a house in Alabama for the two of them, and now she was in New York and wanted the VA to transfer her deeds to New York. And there was clearly something I was missing in that question. So I had to do some research, and I did it on, it's because my philosophy is always, if someone brings you a problem, it's your problem. I never send anyone away unless I knew where I was sending them. And I had to do the research in my spare time when I could. And she came into the office one time during this process bringing a little shoebox in her hand. It had all of her important documents and papers in it. And Ms. Jones was a little stooped over, about 5'1", 5'2", very dark complexion. I had expected to see a lot of wrinkles on her face because she sounded that way on the phone. But her skin was very smooth. It reminded me of an old leather slipper. It was warm, it was smooth. And her eyes were bright, her voice was strong. She was very deferential, always called me Mr. Richard. But she was quite insistent on what she wanted. And from all the sources I learned that back in the 1920s, Ms. Jones she'd never married, but she kept company with a man back then. And she said the only good thing he ever did for her was to give her a son. And she loved that boy. He was the moon and the stars. And he grew up and the war came along. And he was drafted and sent off to Louisiana for training. Now, Ms. Jones says that they didn't treat the colored troops as well as they did the white boys. And he was put in a barracks where there weren't two walls around the barracks. They were just the exterior wall, and the boards didn't fit together well. So that moist Gulf Coast wind in the wintertime just sliced right through the barracks, and he couldn't put on enough clothes to protect against it. And Robert got pneumonia, and he went to the hospital. And after a couple months, they gave him a medical discharge and sent him home. Now, he still wasn't well, but when he could, he worked as a house painter. And Ms. Jones, of course, had always been a housekeeper, working in various homes around Mobile. And she did that, but she had injured her back, and so she couldn't work full-time all the time. But between those things and the disability pension, they managed to qualify for a mortgage, and they bought a little house in the outskirts of Mobile. She said those were the best years of her life, putting that little house together, building a home for themselves. Of course, Robert kept going back in and out of the hospital. She said the VA treated him well, but his lungs kept getting weaker, and one time he went in the hospital and he didn't come out again. But now, the only thing he left her was that house. And that was his gift to her, and she kept it up. And she did what she had to do to make those mortgage payments every month. But then one day, a man came to the door. This was Mr. Walters. He was a white real estate agent in Mobile. He lived in a pink brick house. I've seen a big photo of it. And he told him that the federal government was building an interstate highway right through her neighborhood, going to tear down all these houses and throw her out in the street. But he had a friend at the transportation department, and he could put her in another house. All she had to do was keep up the payments. A different bank, but keep the payments up. So she signed the papers. He moved her into the other house. Now, I looked up in public records, and Mr. Walters owned that other house before he signed it over to her. And he was self-financing the mortgage so that her payments were going directly to him through his bank. But she In her mind, now the second house was her son's house. This was the way it was. And she worked to keep that up. Now Walters, I figure, had planned on this only being a temporary situation, had planned to get the house back. And when it looked like that wasn't going to happen, he came to her again, and he said he had a cousin in Long Island, New York, who couldn't find a decent housekeeper. And would she do him a favor and go up to Long Island and help out his cousin? He said they pay more than they do down here anyway. She said she'd like to help him out, but what would happen to her son's house? He said, as long as you keep up the payments, I'll drop by from time to time and look in on it. So she got on a bus, she went to New York, found a little apartment in Brooklyn, and rode on the bus every day out to Long Island. Now, I don't think he had a relative on Long Island. At that time, in New York City, there were employment agencies that would pay a bounty to people who could ship domestic servants north. And I don't think Walters would have missed out on that chance. But be that as it may, he said people on Long Island treated her well. And he said the only problem was that commute back and forth on the bus. It wasn't any good for her back and it hurt. Now this again probably did not fall into Walter's idea of what he wanted to do, because she kept making those payments. And he finally sent her a letter. Now the letter she kept in the shoebox. I saw the letter. It's rather extraordinary. It said, you've made enough payments on the mortgage. You don't have to make any more payments. 30 days from the date on the letter, he foreclosed on the property and took it back. And now, of course, when I was coming into it, it was about 10 years later, he still owned the property, probably renting it out. Now, Ms. Jones was all confused about all this. She contacted the Alabama VA. And what's going on? They said, we don't have anything to do with you anymore. We've sent all your records to New York. And she said, but I had a house. And they said, well, we've got your New York address. Everything's going there. Well, all right. She'd been transferred from one house to another. Now she was being transferred to this one. She must own this building. So she told the landlord, and he said, when you get the deeds, until then, pay the rent. But at that time in New York, or at least shortly thereafterwards, was when building owners around the city began abandoning the low-rent apartments. And there were abandoned buildings all over the place. And when they stopped collecting the rent in Ms. Jones' apartment, that was proof positive. This had to be her house because they weren't even collecting rent anymore. So she went around and told the other tenants that soon they were going to have to pay her as soon as she could get her deeds from the VA. But as the building deteriorated, she still didn't have the deeds, they began moving out. Anyone who could have paid her rent left. And the people who moved in were the sort of people who don't pay rent. Well now, as this is about when I came into it, and I remember looking at her folder upstairs, and it was about this thick. And most of it was 3- and 4-page handwritten letters talking about deeds and her son and Jesus and all kinds of things. There were also letters from congressmen, city councilmen, and anybody else that she could go find their office who would write to the VA on her behalf asking about these deeds. There was also a note that I had never seen anywhere else saying, do not respond to any more letters from this client. What I did not find was an explanation of what happened to her. So I wrote it out, about 2.5, 3 pages, step by step, chronological order. I told her what her situation was. And I sent it to her. She came into the office then, oh, Mr. Richard, thank you so much. No one's ever done this for me. You're just the best. Thank you so much. Now can you help me get my deeds? Well, it might have kind of wound down at that point. But a little later on, she called me up one day and said that Con Ed had cut off her electricity. She said, I send them a check every month. So I called them up. They said, nobody in that building is paying your electric bill. I said, Ms. Jones is. And they said, well, she's not paying the full amount. I said, that's not what the law says. The law says if someone's paying, you have to keep the power on. And they wanted to argue, and I told them that since we were paying her a pension, the United States Veterans Administration had an interest in her welfare. Now, I don't know what that meant, but then neither did Con Ed. And so they turned her power back on. later, another year or two later, New York City was going through the worst drought ever since the last time. And I remember seeing in the New York Times, there was a 4 or 5 column feature article about how the people in Westchester County couldn't water their lawns because of the water restrictions. They had to put bricks in their toilet tanks. There's a big photograph of that. People in high-end restaurants could not get water with their meals unless they asked for it. I mean, the hardship was just incredible. In this Jones building, the pipes had burst over the winter. And in the basement, there was a stream of water as thick as your arm flowing into the basement 24 hours a day. So I called the water department. And they said they'd get to it. But they must have had a lot of housing buildings like that, because 3 weeks later, they still hadn't gotten out to it. And I called the New York Times. I said, here's a story for you. But they weren't interested. Neither was the Daily News, neither was the New York Post. One of the TV stations told me they just couldn't get decent lighting in basements. We went on like that for a while. Ms. Jones kept going up and down with a bucket to get the water to bring it to use for washing and cooking. I found that there was a program the city had to help people rehabilitate buildings for owner occupants of rental buildings. And so I looked up her, who the owner of record was of the building, and I gave him a call. I found out that he owed $11,000 in back taxes. I said, if you sign the paper over to Ms. Jones, she will assume your debt. And I will pay you $100 for your paperwork. I thought it sounded like a fair deal. But of course, he was a good New Yorker, and he understood that if anyone's making an offer like that, he's being cheated. So he turned me down. After I'd known Ms. Jones for about 7 years, I had an opportunity to go to work for another agency. So I went. The last time I saw her before going, she came in to say that someone had broken into her apartment and had taken her shoebox with all her documents. And why'd they do that, Mr. Richard? Those papers ain't no use to them. And I didn't have an answer that I wanted to give her. And that's kind of a sad story, except when you think that her son really didn't leave her a house. He left her a cause. He left her a reason to get up in the morning. He gave her a purpose. And I came to see her as a kind of a Joan of Arc character who followed the visions in her head, regardless of the naysayers and the obstacles. And for a little while there, now and then, I was privileged to be in her service. Thank you.